Okay, we've got a few people yet to join, but it's 1:35 on the dot, so we'll kick things off. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items to get through. So this session will be recorded. You'll get an upload link shortly afterwards. It'll just be a YouTube video format. And any questions that we can't get to during the Q&A session, we'll try to answer those in that email with the upload link as well. If you have any questions during the presentation, just pop them into the Q&A chat there at the top of the screen, and we'll address them at the Q&A segment at the end. And once we do get to the Q&A, we'll enable microphones for everyone. You'll still need to unmute yourselves when talking. Michelle will lead us in with some common questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Just use the little hand raise function at the top there, and we'll get to your questions. So some quick introductions. My name's Zach. I work in the NettZero carbon accounting business unit. My background is in business communications, greenhouse gas accounting, and NGERS reporting, and I work closely with our carbon customers to quantify and reduce operational emissions. Atif will be leading our presentation today. He's a senior sustainability engineer with a background in electrical engineering and is a NABERS and CBD assessor and a climate active registered consultant here at NettZero. And we're lucky to be joined by Michelle as well, who is also a senior sustainability engineer, a NABERS and CBD assessor, and a Green Star professional, and has a master's in sustainable energy engineering. And before we start things in earnest, we'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal, Turrbal, and Yagara people from whose land we are presenting today, and pay our respects to the diverse and numerous First Nations communities and their leaders across the country. And with that said, I will hand over to Atif to outline some general concepts of carbon neutrality before diving into the recent changes to the rules for buildings.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that intro, Zach. Are you able to see my slide right now? Just for confirmation.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. For the next hour or so, I will be boring you guys with some concept around carbon neutrality and all that stuff. So we'll try to cover as much content as we can today. And there'll be a short Q&A session, as Zach mentioned, at the end of the webinar. And please send through your questions, or if you have anything, please send them to the chat, and we'll answer them at the end, towards the end of the webinar. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the concept of carbon neutrality, but for those who aren't, what exactly is it? The basic principle behind it is about creating a balance against the amount of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere by removing the same amount from it. And this is where emissions against a particular entity would be compensated for by investing in carbon neutral projects. So essentially, a carbon neutral assessment involves measuring and reporting on your emissions and then abating these emissions using offsets. At the moment, individual buildings can be completed, the assessments can be completed using the NABERS or the Green Building Council of Australia's pathways. And these are the only two accredited bodies that are sort of allowed by Climate Active to conduct these assessments. If you do have your own organization submissions, or if you wish to rate your own organization as carbon neutral, you would directly be engaging Climate Active through a registered consultant. But for everything else, you would need a NABERS assessor or a GSAP to complete your carbon neutral assessment. So in today's context, we'll be talking about NABERS particularly. So the minimum requirements to rate your building as carbon neutral are a 4-star NABERS rating. This is both for offices and shopping center type buildings. There are some exceptions over here. If you do not have a 4-star NABERS rating, NABERS requires a commitment being taken from you that that you can achieve a 4-star NABERS rating within 3 years, 3 years time, and so you'd still be able to get a carbon neutral assessment in the interim. There's also a requirement of 3 stars for all of the building types that are not offices and shopping centers. Right, and when it comes to the emission scopes, all scope 1, 2, and 3 emission sources must be reported on. Just for context, scope 1 emission sources are basically any fuel that is burned on site. So it would be your gas, your diesel, if you're burning any coal on site as well, any emissions related to that would be accounted for. Your scope 2s would be indirect emissions that are generated as a result of the activities that are happening on sites. So your electricity would be accounted for in your scope 2 emissions because it's been generated elsewhere but being used within your building. And the scope 3 emission sources would be everything else that are basically emissions that are resulted due to the transmission and distribution of the said services to your building. That being said, there are four emission sources that must be declared within a carbon neutral context. So these are your energy, water, waste, and refrigerants. All four of these are relevant sources, and they must be declared in a carbon neutral rating. The next slide. Yep. So these are some of the timelines that NABERS has put forward when you're completing a carbon neutral assessment. So just for reference, if you're lodging your rating today, the assessment comes back within 10 business days with a level 1 audit, which is just on the energy portion of the rating. This is pretty standard from NABERS. It's always been that case. So, and then we once that energy rating is certified, the carbon neutral calculator, which will be completed by your assessor, that will be lodged to NABERS, and you get another 5 days, basically within which time frame that will be approved. Following that, you would get about 20 days once NABERS has verified all the inputs within the carbon neutral assessment, the inventory has been checked, all your electricity, gas, diesel, water, waste, all those sources are correct. NABERS will provide a confirmation, and then you can go ahead and purchase offsets or LGCs for your rating, which Zach will talk about later towards the end. And then about 5 more days before the rating is certified for carbon neutrality by NABERS, and you get that certificate from NABERS and Climate Active. So around about 40 days, I believe, from the lodgement date. So that's sort of the timeframes that you would look at when you're applying for carbon neutrality. And this will certainly go into your marketing material and all that stuff as well, those timeframes. So just something to watch out for. Yep. And then Yep, and then we get into the NABERS carbon neutral guidance document. So this document was completed by NABERS around March 2024. It is publicly available to download. Zach, if you could please drop a link on the chat. But yeah, that's publicly available for anyone to review and download. This is a very helpful document. It was a long time coming. It was after a lot of feedback from the assessors as well, and from the real estate community in general, because there was a lot of confusion previously, and this has all been clarified in this carbon neutral document. So I've kind of done the groundwork. So we're going to go through most of the major items that were covered in this guidance document, and we'll try to cover as much space as we can in this discourse. So that being said, we'll jump into the first emission source that we have, which is energy. So energy sources constitute of electricity, gas, diesel, and coal if applicable. So just speaking about electricity in general first, there are 2 reporting methodologies that must be completed, and this is from Climate Active. This is what's called the dual reporting. There are 2 methods available. One is the location-based electricity reporting, and the second is market-based electricity reporting. So one might ask, what exactly are these 2 reporting methodologies? So firstly, location-based method. This involves tracking and reporting electricity usage and its corresponding emissions based on specific geographical locations where the electricity is consumed, and it will have the corresponding grid emission factors specific to that location. So, for example, you're in South Australia, you're in New South Wales, you're in Victoria, you will have state-based emission factors that will be applicable. These are released from the NGA factors, National Greenhouse Accounts, every year, and NABERS also updates them, their emission factors accordingly from NGA. So that's the first methodology. A point to note for location-based electricity accounting is a point to note over here is if you do have renewable electricity that you're purchasing, for example, LGCs, or if you have power purchase agreements, these will not be accounted for in the location-based electricity methodology. If you do have LGCs that you are using and you want to include them in your emission inventory, then you would use the market-based method. So the market-based electricity reporting is an approach that focuses on tracking and reporting electricity usage and associated GHG emissions based on the type of electricity products or contracts that an entity purchases. This method affects the choices that consumers make in the electricity market, such as buying renewable energy certificates, which are RECs, or green power contracts, rather than just the physical location of electricity consumption. This method employs the use of an RMF in Australia. So the RMF is a different sort of emission factor, which takes into account the retail power percentage that is changed every year, which is basically accounted for I suppose in layman's terms, the green electricity in the grid. So that will be accounted for with the RMF. I believe it's at 18.48% for 2024 at the moment. So that's already basically the assessment. The NABERS calculator does everything, all of that for you. The assessor would be across this as well. Renewable electricity purchases, as I mentioned, can be reported in the market-based method, and these help in negating the electricity emissions. We will discuss these in the last part of the presentation when we go through the offsets and the LGCs. But yes, they basically help in cancelling out your scope 2 electricity emissions. In terms of the document itself, there have been no major changes to reporting methodologies with respect to energy. That's pretty much straightforward. Anything that that was like all energy sources must be included, and building gas and diesel usage, as I said, is also reported in this section. Yep. Right. Then we move on to the next emission source, which is refrigerants. So refrigerants, previously, these are also reported in the carbon neutral assessment. However, only the refrigerants that were previously, only refrigerants that were under the Kyoto Protocol were required to be declared. Now, any refrigerant type that you're using in your building, which has a GWP, global warming potential greater than 0, must be reported. So each refrigerant type, for example, you're using R410A, 134A, or any of the other types of refrigerant, each of them has a GWP potential, a GWP charge. And that would be translated. That's what converts your kilograms of charge into emissions, into a CO2 number. So any refrigerant that has a GWP greater than 0 must be reported. For the most part, a lot of the buildings, yes, they do use 410A. So that's probably the most major one that you would encounter in these assessments. You might ask how the refrigerant leaks from equipment. So there are a couple of instances where this can happen. The first one is a gradual leak during operations. So you're just running your equipment on a day-to-day, and there might be small amount of leaks that would happen throughout the year of refrigerant gas. NABERS at the moment has a default for that instance. There is a 9% default leakage rate that would be assumed, provided you have no other data to back up the leakage rates. The second option where this might happen is it might be a catastrophic leak during normal operation. The equipment might have broken down. There might have been a pipe burst. There might have been a big leakage of all the refrigerant gas. So that's also a second type of gas leakage as well that might happen. There might be general losses during servicing and maintenance of your equipment. When you're carrying out these pressure and leakage tests, there might be a bit of gas leakage because of that as well. And lastly, the losses at the end of life. So when you're decommissioning your HVAC equipment, what is done with that refrigerant? How is it disposed of? How is it? What happens there? So there might be some losses. So all of these losses are very important, and they must be declared in the carbon neutral assessment because they do contribute to the overall carbon inventory of the building and the greenhouse gas emissions. So 1st of July 2025 onwards, I see there might be a lot of FMs as well on the call. So what does this mean for if you're a facilities manager who's in the building? You will be required from the 1st of July onwards to have a refrigerant gas maintenance register, and it must be maintained with the following information. So the first one is your equipment identifier. So if you're using a chiller, if you're using pack units, each of them would have a serial number or a number that's associated with that. That number should be displayed on this register as well. The equipment type, again, if it's a split unit, pack unit, chiller, that should be identified as well. The type of refrigerant it's using, 410A, 134A, any of the other types, they should all be there as well. The heating cooling capacity of the equipment in kWRs, that should also be mentioned. And the most important one, the charge of refrigerant, how much gas is has been loaded into that equipment, how much is it holding? So that's the most important one. And the sixth one is the service notes for each service. So this is probably the most, I suppose, which will require most engagement from your HVAC contractor. This information must be on the maintenance register as well. So the first point there is the equipment demonstrating symptoms of less than design charge. So you're operating your equipment as normal. You're noticing it's not heating or cooling as it should. So is that could be a cause of a leakage as well. So that's one thing that should be mentioned in the report if it's not demonstrating optimum performance. The second one is was there any charge leak during the service? So when the HVAC contractor went there, did they top up any refrigerant to the equipment? It should be recorded, the kilograms, how much was added. That should be mentioned on the report as well. The third one is was a leak detection exercise carried during this service? So that's basically a pressure test of the equipment. So was that also carried out during the servicing? If so, then that should be recorded in this register as well. And the last one, how much refrigerant was added, if any, to the equipment. So the reason why this is very important is if we have the exact quantities that were added, it is a better result for your overall emissions at the end of the day. If you do not have any data, which we'll go through the next slide, if you don't have this data, then you can still complete an assessment. However, there are certain repercussions to that as well. In addition to the maintenance register, it's important to store and record all service records for the servicing of the equipment. These will be asked for by your NABERS assessor when the carbon neutral rating is being completed. So it's very important to have those monthly, if they're carried on a monthly basis, those monthly service records as well. And any statements from the maintenance contractors would also be required if any refrigerant was added. So please have a chat with your NABERS assessor, and they will probably be able to guide you around the documentation as well. But these are some of the changes that are coming on from the 1st of July onwards when reporting on refrigerants. So one of the challenges that you might have when you're doing when you're dealing with refrigerants is your assessor might ask you for service records or statements, and you don't have any of that available. And there might be two scenarios that might have happened. First one, to the best of your knowledge, no refrigerant leaks had happened. Everything is operating as per normal. You haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary. And the second one is where a catastrophic leak has happened, but you could not record how much was leaked or what amount of refrigerant leaked out. So in those cases, you can still complete an assessment, provided you have the total charge available of that equipment piece. We can use a 9% default leakage rate where no reported leaks had occurred. However, we don't have supporting documentation to verify that. Then a 9% default leakage rate will be applied. Where a catastrophic leak has occurred, we would assume then that all of the refrigerant has leaked out, and 100% leakage rate would be applied for that equipment in question. And that will be translated to your greenhouse gas emissions for refrigerants. Refrigerants will be scope 1 emissions because they are being emitted on site. And that's the category they would fall under. So that should be it for refrigerants. We'll now jump into waste. Go. Yeah. So waste is very important as well. In some cases, they make up the second largest portion of a building's total carbon footprint. In some instances, it might be the largest as well. So they're often, a lot of people often underestimate the waste emissions as well. But once you start accounting for them, they are a pretty significant number for a building. The emissions are calculated based on how much waste is sent to landfill. So this would mean that if you have a higher diversion rate, it would trigger a better result for your total emissions footprint. These will fall under your scope 3 emissions. The waste emissions would follow the same guidelines as energy, where all waste under the building's operational control would have to be included and reported. And this is where tenant engagement is very crucial or important to ensure high diversion rates are achieved. So anything that falls under the building's operational control would have to be reported in the carbon neutral account, and waste would be following the same approach as well. So your tenant waste, as I said, would be a part of that as well. It is acceptable to use NABERS waste ratings data, provided there is no more than a 2-month offset to the energy rating period. So your energy rating period, for example, is running on a financial year basis, and your NABERS waste rating is done about 2 months after that or before that. You can still use that data, provided it's not more than that offset. So that's also allowable by NABERS. General waste and mixed recycling are mandatory inclusions. So at a minimum, your waste should have these two waste streams. However, dealing with a lot of buildings, we do see that there's a lot more waste streams available. There's paper and cardboard, organics, and so on and so forth. The more waste streams you have, the more accurate the emission will be. and the more data we'll have around how much waste was diverted from landfill. So basically, the intention is to divert as much data, as much waste as we can from landfill, so it doesn't end up there and cause emissions. All carbon neutral ratings from 1st of July 2025 onward. This is another change that is coming forward. There would be a waste data quality that would be declared on your PDS for each property. So when you complete a carbon neutral rating, you complete a public disclosure summary, which is a Word document that's available on the Climate Active website as well. It contains your building's inventory, and going forward, it will also have the data quality of the waste on it. So there are 5 data qualities that NABERS has proposed at the moment. There's poor, basic, acceptable, good, and excellent. I will talk a little bit about these in the next slide as well. However, these are NABERS waste ratings are, if you want good or excellent NABERS data qualities, then a NABERS waste rating might be necessary to complete these to have that good result on your PDS. And these scaled emissions will come into effect on the 1st of July 2025 onwards. We do have, we'll talk about that a bit over here as well. So your challenge might be that you have no waste data. A site has not, they have no waste data being recorded for the rating period. They can still complete a carbon neutral rating. NABERS says you can still do one. You can use one of the 3 methods where you might have aggregate data, where you might have number of collections per bin per period. You can use that information to provide to your assessor, and they can calculate your emissions based on that data. The second one is the contract data, where you might have a contract with your waste contractor to pick up X amount of bins in a month. And that data can also be used to complete the waste portion of the account. And the last one is if you have no data available, then the assessor would go on site and they would count how many bins you have. For example, 4 bins for general waste, 5 for recycling, and then some for paper and cardboard. And then we would assume that all of those bins were collected every single day for 365 days. So in all 3 instances where you have no waste data, the data quality will be poor. And the reason for that is not to penalize the building owners in any way. It's so that they can get on top of their waste segregation and their diversion rates. So with the data quality, there will be scale-based emissions going forward after 1st of July. At the moment, this is not in place, but 1st of July 2025 onwards, this will be in effect. So what that means is, for example, if you have your data quality is poor, your waste emissions are calculated to be 100 tons, you would have a scaling on your emissions. So for the poor data quality, it's at 150%. So instead of 100 tons being declared in your account would now say 150 tons because of the data quality. So it's very important we're here. I think most of the buildings that we have dealt with in general, when you go on site, and if you have some sort of waste invoices that you've provided to your assessor, it does come up to be acceptable in most instances, provided good invoices are given. You should also be weighing the waste as well. The contractor should be weighing the waste when they collect the bins every day or every other day whenever they come on site. They do have scales, and they should have calibrated scales where they should be weighing the waste as well. So there's a bit of engagement involved on the building owner's part over here, particularly with your tenants as well. Have a chat, have a conversation with your tenants to raise more awareness of segregation. If you can help them if you can assist them with providing bins as well in their own tenancies, segregated bins, that will also go a long way. We over here at NettZero, we have a roster, so we usually measure our own waste at the end of every day. Every staff member has got a different day, so we would like sort of weigh the bins at the end of the day, and then we record that as well for our own Climate Active submission. As a tenant, like I said, you should be able to take ownership of your waste emissions, which is very important as well. If you do feel you're struggling to record the waste, there are several softwares available that aid and assist in this process as well. There's Bin Tracker. We can provide you more information about that too. But there's several softwares out there that can help you record the waste emissions, waste quantities. So you may be able to put them in your carbon account. But the idea is, yes, the better waste quality you have, the lesser of the scaled emissions that will happen when you're completing the carbon account. That was all for waste. We will now get into the water section. So with regards to the water, there haven't been any major changes to the way water is reported in the carbon neutral context. Water emissions are generally scope 3, and they include, you might ask how the water emissions occur. They might occur from the pumping and treatment of water supplied to the building because of that process, and also because of the pumping and treatment of wastewater discharged from the building. So these are the two instances where you would have water emissions occur. Again, all water provided under the base building's operational control must be declared. So any water that's being used in the building that is under the operational control of the building should be declared. I will have a bit more of a chat about the operational control aspect as well. I believe that's a very important concept. The water emissions are declared by default using combined emission factors for water and wastewater. Again, these are available with NABERS. As an FM, all you need to do is provide your assessor the utility invoices for water, which would have the consumption on them, and then we'd be able to calculate your emissions using that. If you do have your own user-defined emission factors for water and wastewater, these are also acceptable. However, additional evidence must be provided where this is used. So if you do want to use your own emission factors, yes, we would require the additional evidence. At the moment, I believe we use OzLCI. NABERS uses OzLCI database for the emission factors for water and wastewater. And lastly, the water usage from rain or bore water is also very important. If you have that data, it should be collected on site and should be included where metering is available, as wastewater emissions will not account for this if based on the utility mains supply alone. So all of that should be accounted for as well. I believe I might have, my apologies, there was a slide in between on, I think it was this one, yep, in the mix up there. This got skipped up. So this is also this is basically applicable for all of the sources as well, for water, energy, waste, and refrigerants. It's basically identifying what should be included or excluded within my rating scope. So for what as an FM you might ask, as an assessor as well, you might ask, like, what should I be putting in? Your NABERS rating might have some exclusions that you performed as a result of the submission. However, you might need to net those back in as part of the carbon neutral claim. So the solution, the best way to understanding this is there's three points there that are important to note. The first is the geographic boundary of the building. Do these emission sources occur within that geographic boundary of the building? If so, yes, they should be included in there. The building operations and operational control. Are these emissions under the direct control of the building management? If so, do they have are they in charge of turning a particular source on or off, or do they have the controls for it? Are they paying for this emission source? So all of these questions are something that should be asked. So that falls under your operational control, and they should be included as well. And the last one, which is for scope 3, is relevance. Relevance is basically, I believe you'd have a lot of these in the mixed use sort of buildings. There is sort of a relevance test as well that you can carry out, which will be around the following factors. So the first one is the size of the emission source. Is it a large enough emission source that it will influence the carbon account? It will be more than the 1% materiality aspect. Is it more than 1% of your total account? If so, yes, it should be included. Influence, does the organization have influence over this emission source? Are they able to affect how it occurs? If so, yes, that should be included. Risk, that's another factor. The risk, does this emission source pose a potential risk to the organization if it is not managed or reported? So is there a particular emission source that if you do not declare this, it might have a repercussion down the line if it wasn't declared? So that's also a very important one. And there's also stakeholder perception, where your customers or investors might want a particular source to be included as well. Then you should be putting that source in as well if it's important to your stakeholders, excuse me. And the last one is sector specificity. So if there's any sector specific emissions or emission sources in your building, then those would also be accounted for in that relevance sort of guideline. So there's certain relevance tests that you can carry out with your building and identifying the emission sources. So you would have different scenarios where you would have a small sort of like you've got a water connection down to your retailers. It is not it is being submitted. However, the retailers aren't being charged for it. You're responsible for that water source. Then that exclusion that had happened under the NABERS rules might have to be netted back into your carbon neutral assessment. So it's just one of those examples where that might occur, and just some of the things that you might have to think about when you're completing a carbon neutral claim. I think that should be all the technical aspects of things. I believe I've covered everything there. Go across the four. Zach, I'll hand over to you to just talk about the offsets portion of the assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Atif. So when it comes time to actually offset the emissions, there are several different standards of unit that are accepted here in Australia. There's, of course, the Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACCUs, international units, more commonly known as voluntary carbon units, or VCUs, and LGCs, which are Australian large-scale generation certificates representing 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy. So while they're not technically an abatement type offset unit, LGCs can be used to counterbalance Scope 2 emissions from grid electricity with an equivalent amount of renewable energy claimed by retiring the LGCs. So a great option for tenants or those who cannot influence a green power purchasing agreement. For offsetting the remaining Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions, we generally encourage a blend of units from different projects, regions, and methodologies. Diversification is perhaps the best defence against over-allocating a single unit to a significant portion of emissions. If something comes out about, a flaw in a methodology or a dodgy project developer or some sort of regional problem with credit issuance, it's good to spread that risk over several different types of credits, so all your eggs aren't in one basket, basically. It's also preferable that offset units are relatively recent. We like to refer to the year of issuance of that unit as the vintage, so like a wine, and best practice is to use recent units that are ideally of the same vintage as the period you're trying to offset. So using 2022 or 2023 vintage units for a 2023 reporting period. Methodologies and standards change and revisions are made to issuances based on latest information and modelling. Climate Active is currently considering putting a 5-year cap on how old units can be when used for certification. So if that comes through, expect to see more demand for those recent vintage units. A diverse offset portfolio might use LGCs from an Australian solar farm to avoid Scope 2 emissions from energy, then use 2 different ACCU units and 2 different VCU units to offset the remaining Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions. So we'd consider this a balanced offset portfolio. Also know that in terms of certifying buildings as carbon neutral, just like organisations, the offsets you use are visible on the public disclosure statement, which is widely available on the Climate Active website. So this means that anyone can look up the project code and read all about the carbon credit projects being used for your certification. Hopefully it's not a Four Corners story. It also means that people can take that project code and search for those exact units on market, see things like pricing and issuance records. So we generally advise against using, $1.50 or $1.20 units to offset a whole 3,000 tonne emissions inventory, especially if there are older units, might not be a good look. So we'll keep it brief on the offsets. There's a lot more to unpack. If you're interested, we can run a whole separate webinar in the future that covers offsets in a lot greater detail. So, if that sounds interesting, let us know and we can set that up. And with that, we'll move into the Q&A section with Michelle starting us off with some common questions, and then we'll open it up to the room. And when we do that, we'll first address the questions in the chats, and then after that, I will enable the microphones. You'll still need to unmute yourselves, and then just use that hand raise function, and we'll take your questions around the room.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. We'll jump into the Q&A. First off, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. It is Michelle's birthday today, so happy birthday to her that she's joined us today. Michelle is a very senior assessor as well. She has done heaps of carbon neutral ratings and has been doing NABERS for quite some time now. So she brings a lot of expertise to this field. I thought I'd just have a chat with you, Michelle, about what some of the biggest challenges that you've had in completing a carbon neutral rating, particularly around the site visits. What do you think would be required from an FM's point of view when they're trying to do a NABERS carbon neutral site visit or dealing with a NABERS carbon neutral site visit?
Yeah, I will unmute myself also for that question. Thanks, Atif, for that lovely intro, and I'm happy to be here. So with the site visits, because we try to do it in conjunction with an energy and water rating site visit also for the NABERS, we kind of trying to optimize the time so we don't use it unwisely. But I see that most issues are around where to look. Most assessors might not be aware where, for example, the refrigerants would be located. So top priority would go to all the mechanical switch rooms, all the different areas like lift motor rooms, anything that has a heat source that could be in need of a split unit or different unit that would use the refrigerant. That's a top priority. Other than that, checking security office rooms or facility managed offices, mainly any areas in the basement. They tend to have a unit themselves. So just finding those typical spaces that would have this refrigerant type of equipment is very important. Another thing that we would like to have a look at is different waste streams, different waste bins, just to ensure that the data we're seeing is actually what is on site, that nothing is missing, that we're verifying that all the things are being picked up or all the streams are there. That's generally what we look for mostly in terms of what I think is not overlooked, but sometimes hard, especially if you're starting out as a new assessor.
Yep, got you. Now that makes a lot of sense. Just on refrigerants again, we have gone in the past on some site visits where there was no data available, there was no register available as well. Kind of going in the blind there. What would you suggest, like we do in those instances when there's when you don't have that register available from the client?
As I said, start from the top and go down. That's my priority, and just go to all the rooms that you may think have a heat source. Also ask the question to the facility manager or security guard in case you get stuck with one of them, to just say, okay, well, where is the lift motor room? Get the stack plan, go with you, tick off everything. I'm very methodological when I go through stuff. So ticking off the stuff that I've seen is really important, I think, just to keep that kind of record, also what you see and what you didn't see. And then creating the refrigerant register yourself, but then also getting it validated with the site team. Doing that, I think minimizing the issues of missing something is very important.
That's very true. That's very well said, Michelle. I think the register, as I mentioned, 1st of July 2025 onwards. So it's a bit of time for all the sites to prepare for that. And it'll be very good once that's available. It'll help you check and balance against what you have on site and what is being serviced. It'll be very helpful for as a facilities manager as well to manage your equipment. Thanks for that, Michelle. And then also in that same vein, I would like to talk about a bit about waste as well. Like when you're going on site, what are the biggest challenges that from FM's point of view you might have around the waste portion of a carbon neutral assessment?
Well, I did briefly touch on the way what to look for on site. So perhaps looking at the data instead of what we get as evidence for the pickup. So best case scenario, we get like the daily pickups, and it's in the format that NABERS and Climate Act have approved, preferable in kilos and preferable with each stream shown. And the main issue I see with the data itself is that it's not in a compliant format, or that a lot of different waste streams is not being shown as a relevant stream that NABERS has as a default emission. So with that, we always try to work with NABERS or with the site team to try to improve or allocate this stream to something relevant, so we don't penalize the rating. But what I see most cases going forward, and have been in the past, that we have to allocate anything that's not a default to be a general waste, and that is a bit of a issue when the stream might actually be recycled. So I think the site visit might not be too hard if you just go and have a look at what's on site and trying to understand how the building works itself. If you have a tenant that is very secure, they probably will have secure paper. Make sure that's in the waste stream, or just asking the questions, which you got to experience. Why is not any waste picked up on X date? Just these simple things, I think is very important.
So doing sort of a waste audit on your own data that you have available as well.
Yeah, and that helps also with the FM, to ensure that the data itself is good quality going forward, as that's much more important as of for next year, 1st of July, as you were saying in the QA. So I think just preparing for those scenarios that will come now will help improve the penalty that we might have on the waste going forward.
Yep, that's perfect, Michelle. So the key takeaway, I think, from the waste point of view is A, ensuring that if your waste provider is providing you invoices, to have a good record of those so you can give them to your assessor. And B, if they're not doing that, or if you haven't gotten the invoices, if they're not weighing the waste, then having that conversation with your waste contractor that should be weighing each collection. They should have calibrated scales and should be able to provide you that data. All of this will go a long way in mitigating and reducing those waste emissions that you would have. As I mentioned, they make up most of the time the second largest portion of your emissions. The last question from myself, Michelle, like a particular one, if you have a lot of the buildings might already have a carbon neutral rating, and they might want to shift these ratings to align more with their financial year reporting or their calendar year reportings. What would be sort of the challenges there when you're trying to shift a rating that already has a carbon neutral certification in place, and you're shifting the rating periods backwards or forwards?
I think the biggest challenge is how we do not recycle, but how we can reuse some of the ILGCs and offsets that has been used in the previous rating, because there will be an overlap period. So say we have 2 months overlapping, that means we should be able to use some of the ILGCs offsets from the previous rating into the new carbon neutral assessment. But how we calculate that is very important, because we can't estimate it, and it has to be done on a monthly basis, so we can then adjust it and allocate what is actually being used for the overlapping period, rather than just dividing by 12, because that is not very accurate. So just having those manual meter reads, which I know everyone is hating when I go and say, where's your manual meter reads for gas and water, particularly because the billings are usually not monthly, very important. So we can then calculate the water and gas usage for that period. Or with refrigerants, the same there. Do you have the leakage rate actually reported on a monthly basis if necessary? Or the same with waste. Hence, we're saying daily pickup is preferred. Just that kind of data is important, so we can then allocate it accurately and actually be able to minimize what you have to purchase for the next rating period for the carbon neutral assessment. Right.
Okay. So the intention then would be not to allocate any extra offsets than what is exactly needed for those overlapping periods. Thank you so much, Michelle, for those questions. Zach, I believe we have some coming up in the chat as well.
Yes. So Atif, are there any exceptions for water in end of use or end of trip facilities? Sorry.
Right. So end of trip facilities would come under the minimum water coverage, water requirements for NABERS. So they would have to be included into your NABERS assessment, as well as your carbon neutral assessment as well. So end of trip will be a base building service sort of, and that should be accounted for. But yeah, that's Michelle. Would you agree with that statement as well?
Yeah, I do agree, and I do know where it's coming from. I do understand a lot of buildings nowadays, they upgrade it end of trip and using a lot more water going forward, probably. But unfortunately, there's nothing we can do as a TIF for saying a minimum inclusion for the rating, and as that also, because it's within the boundary included in your carbon account.
Thank you. Okay, we've got another question about LGCs here. What regulation is around companies providing LGC offsets? So the Clean Energy Regulator says they don't regulate the secondary market for LGCs, so it's pretty much at the buyer and seller's discretion. So that there's not regulation on the secondary market for LGCs, unlike, say, something like an Australian Carbon Credit Unit, which is considered a financial instrument, therefore it falls under the purview of ASIC. LGCs and VCUs are outside of that scope. We've got a question maybe for Michelle and Atif as well. What if someone commits to achieving a 4-star in 3 years to submit their carbon neutral, and they can't achieve it after 3 years? And the second part of the question is, are there any requirements for a Green Star pathway, something like the 4-star minimum rating for NABERS?
Yep. So there is a sort of a guideline around that as well, where the minimum NABERS energy, if it's not achieved and a commitment cannot be made, the alternative is to disclose the following information in the PDS of the building. So you should mention why the minimum NABERS energy made rating could not be achieved, why a commitment could not be made to achieve, or what happened that it could not be done in those 3 years, and what the building's emission reduction strategy is in accordance with the NABERS rules. So what is your emission reduction strategy? What are you doing on site to reduce those emissions? However, if you can't justify these, and at the end of the 3 years, if you haven't been able to justify these, then the carbon neutral status of the building can no longer be certified. So that's something to look into as well, as to why you could not achieve that minimum 4-star rating. I believe for Green Star, Michelle, there was a 4-star requirement there as well under the new rules. There's been a major rule change at GBC as well, but I think there was a 4-star requirement there too, if not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly what Atis was saying. Yeah, so we're still on version 1.2, but yeah, version 2 is coming out and it's already out, and you can use part of it. But yeah, same thing there.
Right. And then we've got another question about waste. So how can general waste composition impact the offsets? For example, if a big portion of general waste going to landfill is inert materials, and can we use this to reduce the amount of offsets required?
Inert materials. Okay, that's an unusual one. The idea is basically, yep, anything basically that's going to landfill and it's not reused, for whatever reason, if it is being reused, or we do sometimes get confirmation as well that your waste provider you might be putting something in the red bin, and your waste provider might be doing something on their end where they might be using or segregating the waste and putting something to some of the waste to recycling. That is also a confirmation we can get if you're able to verify those quantities, I suppose. How much exactly is going to landfill? If you can segregate that better, then we're able to put that under recycling, under those recycling categories. However, if it's not being recorded, then unfortunately, we follow the conservative approach where we would allocate all of that to general waste, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any future plans to expand the carbon neutral assessment to include embedded emissions?
Ooh, okay. That might be a question for NABERS, I believe. Yeah, that's a very technical question. So we will try to answer as many as we can, but that's a very specific one. But yeah, we can get in touch with NABERS and confirm that as well. As far as I know, not at the moment. But yeah, that's probably a better question for them directly.
Okay, and sorry, we've got a second part to that previous general waste inert materials question. So, for a base building NABERS and a carbon neutral office base building, the question asker's understanding is that refrigerant gas data for the retail tenants for an office building has to be reported, even though the rating is base building. Is that correct?
If the units are being managed and operated by the base building, they're under their operational control, then they would come under that same concept, and yes, they would have to be declared. If it is a private retailer that's got its own chiller system, their own entire HVAC system, and it's just for the retail portion, and they're responsible for it, they pay for the usage for it, for the electricity usage, thermal usage, all of that stuff, then it doesn't have to be included in that carbon neutral account because it's outside the base building's operational control, if that makes sense. Michelle, yeah?
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
Yeah.
So that would be a very yep. So again, it comes all around to that operational control. What is under the operational control of the building? In some cases, you might be able to exclude certain emission sources if it's been separately submetered, if the tenant is paying for that usage, or if they're using that data for their own carbon neutral claim, then you might be able to exclude those emission sources as well.
Brilliant. So I'll now turn on mics for attendees. You'll still need to unmute yourselves, but we've got 5 minutes left in the call. If anyone has any other questions they'd like to ask, pop your hand up and we'll take your questions. And you're still welcome to pop questions into the chat as well if you'd prefer that. Okay.
Zach, do you want to take that? Yeah.
Sure. So Locke from NABERS has chimed in. There's no consideration to include embodied carbon for a carbon neutral rating via the NABERS pathway. NABERS is coming up with an embodied carbon rating tool soon, which will be separate from the carbon neutral rating. Thank you very much for the clarification there.
Thanks, Lodge. Yeah. We have someone from NABERS there. Yeah.
Okay, last chance for any other questions. Otherwise, we might put a fork in it. Chief Michelle, parting comments?
Just for myself, yeah, just to make sure that you're on top of those changes that are coming up, to have good data around all those energy and all those emission sources, to make sure you're filing everything and providing them to your assessor, and also to allow yourself and your assessor enough time to certify those carbon neutral ratings. That's also very important. But I think, yeah, that should be it for me. Yep.
I might also add that I think it's extremely important that you get on top of it early, not a month or two before you start the process. I think doing a bit of a assessment on where you are standing at the moment with the new rules is a good idea, just to make sure you meet all the requirements and that you have time to fix or get something in place so you don't get kind of blindsided with a poor result and have to buy additional emissions just to get your carbon neutral assessment across the line for the next year. I think that's the parting comment for me.
Wonderful. And if you think of any other questions late at night or tomorrow or whenever, shoot us an email. We'd be more than happy to address them for you. But on that note, we'll wrap things up and keep an eye out for the follow-up email with the recording link. And we'll hopefully see you in some more webinars in the future. Thank you very much.
So thanks, guys.
Guys.
See ya.
See ya. Bye.